Hi again, and we're going to go through now the attachment section of your CEDAR assessment. So same as with research methods, use this audio commentary please to annotate your papers as best as what you can. Obviously your teachers will be checking the quality of your annotations to see whether or not you've done it effectively and that you're able to kind of learn from any errors that have been made. So off we go with question 1 on the attachment topic. It was pretty well answered, this one. There was kind of the bulk of students either allocated 2 marks or 4 marks. The reason being, I'll draw your attention to it straight away, is that some of you could only ever be given 2 marks because despite the fact that you knew the behavioural characteristics of a resistant child and a secure child, you didn't phrase your answers as differences. So students may describe one difference in detail or more than one in less detail, but to get the 4 marks, it had to be phrased as a difference. So for example, you needed to say what it says here in the mark scheme. Securely attached children may be subdued when the mother leaves, whereas insecure resistant show intense distress. Likewise with reunion behaviour, secure children will greet their mother warmly when she comes back and be easily soothed or whatever you wanted to say, whereas insecure resistance may cling to their mother. So for a lot of you, you will be disappointed with the fact that you only got 2 out of 4, and it would have been so easy for you to access the full 4 marks of credit had you just phrased them as comparisons rather than just 2 separate paragraphs. If you've been allocated 3 marks, it might be that your teacher has kind of read your answer and thought you've got really, really good detailed knowledge, and basically what you've done is a mirrored paragraph. So you've done exactly a description of a secure child and then the exact same description of the behavioural categories in the same order with the same wording for a resistant child, and that was a bit more of a comparison than if you'd just basically randomly described a secure and then randomly described a resistant. But like I said, most students either fell into full credit or half credit. There should really only have been a handful who got 3. And like I said, they would have been ones with really good descriptions, just not necessarily compare, contrast, but there was some element of a comparison built in there. So on the whole, it did seem that most of you knew the behavioural traits of those 2 types of children. Obviously, if you'd made reference to avoidant children, you got it muddled up, then there wasn't going to be any credit there. Just ignore kind of what it's saying on the mark bands here. This is an old mark scheme, so it makes reference to a previous question where it was to compare avoidance versus resistance. But the mark bands would be exactly the same for the question that we've asked you here, which is secure versus insecure resistance. So, like I say, should be easy to see where you went wrong there, but any questions, ask your teacher directly there if you're still unsure as to why you got what you got. Question number 2 on the attachment section was really, really well answered. I think a lot of you had very strong knowledge of the 2 major studies in this area. So there was a lot of detailed reference to the Chagani study in my classes. I'm not sure what was shown elsewhere, but certainly the Chagani study, students seemed to know that it was low levels of activity in the brain as a result of institutionalisation, but then there was real detailed elaboration of which areas of the brain were underactive, such as the amygdala and the hippocampus, and then further on from that you were saying things such as underactivity in the amygdala would give them less fear response, and that might be why they don't show a reaction to strangers. So it was really kind of well thought through. Furthermore, there was some good reference to the Rutter study and not just the IQ stuff. So the best answers were the ones that could quote the IQ levels for the Rutter study. But there was a lot of good kind of expanding of answers there. So talking about the fact that they were physically underdeveloped. So a lot of you were talking about being malnourished, tendency to develop rickets. A lot of you were talking about developmental dwarfism. A lot of you were talking about disinhibited attachment styles, whereby they have no fear of strangers and they attach really quickly to them. So there was a lot of you who were getting 3 or 4 marks there. Obviously, to get into 4-mark territory, you did need reference to specific research and you needed kind of accurate findings. But a lot of you were able to get 3 marks, which is less detailed but generally accurate. You had a good understanding of the effects of institutional care. You maybe just didn't know specific findings. Obviously, if you're getting 1 or 2 marks, it was just because it was too brief. So maybe you were saying things like they have problems with attachment in later life. That it doesn't really show a great deal of understanding. So that second question, like I say, was really quite strong. The third question was also really strong. I think a number of you ran out of time, and that was evident from your work, but it wasn't through a lack of knowledge, it seemed. Not for most students anyway. There were some students, obviously, who did the wrong topic area or who just hadn't revised it, and that was pretty obvious. So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to talk you through what we expected in this answer, and kind of you being able to then pitch yourself in these bands. So the question was, discuss research into the influence of early attachment on childhood and adult relationships. Now, there are 2 different ways in which you could have answered this question, and you need to skim through your own answer now whilst I'm explaining it to see which route you took. So the first route, you can see here underneath it in bold, the first route that you might have taken was to describe research studies for your AO1, so your 6 marks of description, and then for your AO2, all right, or 3, sorry, for your discussion material, you'd have provided commentary on those studies. So for those people who took that route, normally what we were seeing in the description was reference to Hazen and Shaver's love quiz, so you'd started with a description of that, maybe some reference to Myron and Smith, maybe reference to Kirkpatrick. There was all sorts of different little studies that you were referencing. So there was a lot of good detail there in relation to the fact that children who were securely attached become more confident and more playful as children. A lot of reference to research that had shown that resistant children are more likely to become bullies, and avoidants are more likely to become the victims of bullies. So if you'd gone down that route, your AO1 credit was given for descriptions of those studies. Some people will have dropped down into these bottom bands here. So if you can see, just bear with me a sec, if you can see kind of like the level 1 and 2 answers, limited knowledge of theory and or research might have been presented. Now, for a number of you, the description of Hazen and Shaver wasn't necessarily detailed enough. It was quite vague, so you were making reference to the fact that they were investigating the childhood attachment styles and then correlating with adult relationships, and that there was a similarity, but that really kind of didn't go into enough detail. So if you did take that first route, but you've kind of dropped marks, then it's likely that your description of Hazen and Shaver wasn't detailed enough, and you might want to go back into your booklets now and kind of check those bits of detail that were missing. For example, the fact that it was a newspaper quiz, there were 620 responses, the percentage findings for the styles of attachment, and the descriptions of the adult relationships as well. That level of detail was what you needed in order to get up into a level 3 answer. So for those students who have described studies for their AO1, the AO2 needed to have come from evaluating those bits of research. And for those of you who took that kind of strategy or that route, the methodology points weren't necessarily that great. The reason why is because they weren't very well applied. So for example, some of the evaluation points that you could have used were the fact that Hazen and Shaver based their study on retrospective data, the fact that it was a correlational study, and the fact that there were other extraneous variables that hadn't been considered. So a lot of you did make reference to those points, but you didn't expand them. So for example, the retrospective point, what you need to be saying there is that you are asking participants to recall their earliest experiences of their relationships with their parents, and that over time may have been changed and may have been kind of like disrupted by other experiences that they've gone through. Their recollection of what their early childhood relationship with their parents was might not necessarily be a valid one. It might have been skewed or distorted with time and based on experiences that they've had since that point forward. So we're not really sure whether or not their description of their first relationship is an accurate one. So that's how you kind of should have expanded the retrospective point. The correlational point is arguing that there are other factors that they didn't control for in that study. So Hazen and Shaver are assuming that because they got a correlation between early childhood attachment style and adult attachment style, that it's a cause and effect relationship, and it possibly isn't. So we refer here to the fact that there are qualities such as our innate temperament or our innate preferences as an adult, which they've not really accounted for. It might not be the fact that you as an adult engage in avoidant relationships, so you like your independence. That might not be because you had an avoidant attachment style in infancy. It might just be your personality, the fact that you like being on your own and that you like a little bit of interpersonal distance, etc., etc. So it doesn't consider people's kind of innate temperaments and kind of personal preferences in relationships. It wrongly assumes a causal relationship. And then the last point is to do with the fact that there is contradictory evidence and contradictory findings, that there are other extraneous variables that have more of an impact on our attachment styles as an adult than those early childhood relationships as stated by Hazen and Shaver. So for example, Zimmerman claims that parental divorce during kind of like mid to late childhood has more of an impact on adult relationship styles than what the earliest childhood relationships or attachment styles do. So for those of you who took that first route in, your description was all your studies, and then your evaluation was all the methodology and the contradictory points. Some of you did apply them really, really well, in which case you were shooting straight up into a level 3, level 4 answer. But if you did lack any detail, you maybe lacked application of your methodology points, you might find yourself maybe top of level 2, possibly into level 3. The second route that you might have taken, which I have to say was the more common route, was to use theory as your description. So it says here, term research may be theory and it may be studies. So the theory, which most of you went for, was Bowlby's kind of earliest childhood attachment theories. So saying that the earliest attachments that we have with parents give us an internal working model, which acts as a framework and a blueprint. It provides you with expectations for what to encounter in later relationships. And for the most part, students who did do that did it very, very well. They then went on to elaborate about the continuity hypothesis, so this idea that what you become as an adult is shaped by your earliest experiences. It is a continuation of that style of relationship. So those students who kind of went down that route, like I say, you were doing it very, very well, and that tended to give you good AO1 marks. The best ones that I saw who did that, in order to get these 6 marks, then kind of said this can be illustrated by, and they listed some of the research that I mentioned to you previously. So this idea that insecure resistant children become bullies, insecure avoidant children are the victims of bullying, the fact that secure children have more playmates, they are more confident, etc, etc. So they just kind of finished off their description with bits of reference to studies. Then for their evaluation, the main piece of supporting evidence that they used was Hazen and Shaver. Again, it differed in terms of quality, so I'm not going to repeat what I've just said there in terms of what you should have been including for Hazen and Shaver, but for the most part, students were correctly using Hazen and Shaver to support the idea of continuity hypothesis, that what you are in childhood correlates or matches with what you are as an adult. And then in order to pick up those last evaluation points, people were again referencing all of those evaluation points that I just mentioned before. So contradictory evidence, innate temperament, etc, etc. Now, you might be thinking, right, well, I did all of that, Fiona, and I don't understand why I've ended up where I have, why I've been placed into this band. There were different structures that were being adopted by students, and what I would say is that the students who got into level 4 response were the ones who had a clear focus in terms of their argument. So you can see here, in order to get into that top mark, it's clear, it's coherent, it's focused, it's accurate, it's thorough, and it's effective. The best answers were the ones who did continuity hypothesis, internal working model, little bit of kind of illustrative research, into Hazen and Shaver for supporting evidence, and then some sort of commentary on the back of that. Students who kind of were missing bits and bobs throughout their essays, they were probably going to be put into level 3 responses, because you had a good understanding of most of the points, but it just wasn't focused enough. It wasn't kind of fastened together clearly. Certainly in my classes, I had a lot of students who knew all of this stuff, but I only put them in as level 3 responses because I didn't feel that they actually understood the points that they were trying to make, and it was almost like they'd rote learned what was in the booklet without connecting the ideas together. So if you are one of those students, I would certainly annotate your paper now with that kind of idea, that it needs to be connected a little bit better. You need to think about the strengths and weaknesses and how you're kind of piecing it together. Again, there are sample answers on Moodle here for you to have a look at. If you are really interested in improving in psychology and achieving the best marks absolutely possible on those progression exams, it would be a good idea for you to look at a sample response to see how maybe another student has done that. So that's the end of the feedback video, guys. Obviously, any questions, ask your teacher about them, but hopefully everything's been explained to you there in sufficient detail for you to fill in that back page. Okay, see you later.